In 1998, a nonprofit was founded called ZeroDivide that was genuinely well ahead of its time, bringing internet access and technology to low-income families. Then over the next 18 years, they were successful, raising $50 million from some major foundations: the Ford Foundation, the California Endowment, the California Wellness Foundation. They operated 2 primary programs, and their funding was nearly all raised in support of those programs. By all measures, things were going great. Then, in 2016, and nearly without warning, they collapsed. One day they were here, then they were gone. Then when the major foundations that had funded ZeroDivide came asking what had happened to the programs, what had happened to their money, no answer was given. Well, eventually somebody did provide an answer. So was it the board chair or the former executive director finally coming clean, telling what had happened? No, that would have been great. It was the California Attorney General. And they were not pleased. Hi, welcome back to the Nonprofit CFO. Today we're talking about one of the most important and misunderstood topics in nonprofit finance: restricted and unrestricted funding, and what happens to organizations who don't pay attention to the difference. The funny thing about the ZeroDivide story is that in this case, the people involved seemed to generally know that what they were doing was wrong, and did it anyway. Let's get into it. By the mid-2010s, the organization was running 2 flagship programs: Digital Bridge, working with other nonprofits and libraries to adopt new technology, and the Renaissance Journalism Center, advancing equity in how news stories were reported. Foundations had given money specifically for these 2 programs: the Ford Foundation, the Whitman Institute, the Vesper Society, the Wincode Foundation, others. A quick primer on nonprofit giving. There are 2 basic kinds of funding: general operating, which can be used by the organization for anything within its charitable mission: staff salaries, rent, supplies, anything. The other type of donation is restricted, where the donor gives funds on the condition they can only get spent on certain things. These restrictions are made in writing at the time the gift is given, and the organization accepts both the money and the restrictions at the same time. The gifts at the center of this story were restricted, very clearly understood by both parties at the time the gifts were given, for Digital Bridge and the Renaissance Journalism Center and nothing else. But come 2012, ZeroDivide's unrestricted revenue, the funds they could use on general operations, was drying up. And this happens all the time in the nonprofit world. We start off with great intentions and a great budget and a great plan, and then life happens. So what? We make adjustments. We cut general operating where we can for the rest of the year. We scale back or eliminate some programs when it's possible. We adjust. We adapt. We make it work. Even sometimes we have conversations with the funders themselves. Go to them, let them know what it is that we're experiencing, our challenges, and see what some of our options are. The thing that we never do, never dip into restricted funds to cover general operations. Well, at ZeroDivide, according to the California Attorney General's findings, rather than making hard decisions about cutting costs or finding new revenue sources, leadership made a different choice. Yeah, they used restricted program funds to cover general ops. Salaries for employees who weren't working on those programs, expenses that had nothing to do with Digital Bridge or Renaissance Journalism. Slowly, like just a little bit at first. Just a little bit will be fine, right? Right? Well, since staff were behaving irresponsibly, at least the board, right? Once the board found out, they'd step in and make changes, and they'd contact the funders, and they would say, we're sorry, we did so much wrong, we're going to have new oversight, and we're going to recoup the money, and we're going to make changes. The programs are right on track. We're very sorry, but we'll do better moving forward, right? That's what that's what happened? Oh no, not them too. No, according to the AG's complaint, they knew. Budget documents reviewed by the board clearly showed restricted funds being used for this purpose. This was said in actual meetings, apparently, quote, we risk further dipping into restricted funds. They acknowledged that what they were doing was wrong, and then they kept doing it. I want to be really careful here to not turn this into some morality tale about bad people doing bad things, making bad decisions, because what I think happened here is more nuanced and more interesting. I think what happened at ZeroDivide, and what I see sometimes in my work, is you get caught up in what you're doing and the work that you're doing, and you're thinking, well, what's important is that we're providing these services, and what we're dealing with at the end of the day is a kind of an accounting technicality, right? Like, it's just cash. You can take money from one place, use it in another, and then later on we'll get more unrestricted funds in and it'll backfill. It's borrowing, but it's not even really borrowing. It's not taking out a real loan. So we'll make it work on the back end. Directors tell themselves that their mission is too important to let something like an accounting technicality mess with it. But restricted funds are not a loan. You know this. They're not a bridge. They belong legally to the donor, and the donor has entrusted you and your organization with spending them to provide certain services. That's it. That's what they're for. And doing anything else violates your state's charitable trust laws, violates the trust of the donor, certainly your fiduciary responsibility as a director, and can have legal consequences. In April 2022, California Attorney General Rob Bonta announced a settlement had been reached in their initial filings against ZeroDivide. First of all, ZeroDivide would be shut down, dissolved permanently. Now, they had been inactive for several years, so this was primarily a formality. However, what was not a formality was that as part of a settlement in which the directors and officers admitted to no wrongdoing or illegal activity, 2 of its officers were barred from running another nonprofit in California over the next 3 years. And additionally, ZeroDivide and its directors and officers had to pay over $460,000 in damages, penalties, and fees. AG Bonta said simply, "Donor intent must be honored." When a donor or foundation gives money to your nonprofit with conditions attached, those restrictions usually take one of 2 forms. Temporary restrictions are when money must be used for a specific purpose or within a specific time frame. Once you meet the condition, the restriction is released. Permanent restrictions are rarer, typically where somebody is giving to an endowment that must stay restricted forever. The principal can never be spent, and only the interest or dividends can be spent for operations. The most common type you'll encounter as a nonprofit is temporary restrictions. A grant says that this $40,000 must be used for our after-school reading program during the next school year. The money is yours, but only for that purpose and only during that window. And that is why unrestricted funds are gold. They pay for everything else: rent, salaries, insurance, program funds not covered by those restricted funds. Everything. And here's something that we talk about with nearly every client we work with. A common trap in nonprofit funding models is an over-reliance on unrestricted funds at the expense of having enough operating funds to get by. But here are some strategies that may help you out of this trap. 1. When you create your ask for restricted funding from donors, get as much of it unrestricted as possible. Now, I know this sounds easy and this sounds dumb, but more and more donors, foundations are allowing you to ask for a certain amount, even over their minimum of operating costs or admin costs or de minimis costs, indirect costs. They're allowing you to make a case for more. So make that case. Do it. And if you do that right at the outset, you have a higher amount of unrestricted funds coming from those same sources. 2, even for the portion of this that does have a direct restriction to the program, make sure that you're capturing all of those direct costs from the organization. If your executive director spends 10% of their time managing this program, put that in there as a direct cost, as a salary cost. Of course, you're going to be capturing your program staff, but what about the space that they occupy in your office? What about the storage space needed for that program within your offices? Say that's 25% of your total leased space, then 25% of your rent or your mortgage should be in there as a direct program rental expense. Now, obviously, not all of this is going to be universal. It's not going to work the same for every grant. But the important thing here is when you have questions, ask your funder directly. Work with them. These people, this is their job to work with you, and often they care about the people that you are serving almost as much as you do. While most funders do leave some overhead or admin or indirect cost allowance within your program budget, around 10% typically, what I'm arguing here is that if you need more, ask for more. If 10% is not enough, then make a case for more. Ultimately, it's what's going to serve best the people who we are serving in the community, and it's what we and our funders want. When we take these steps at the time that we ask for funding, at the budgeting phase, we get it included in restricted funding. And then throughout the rest of the year, we have more freedom to run our organizations the way that we need to. We're less stuck. That gap between required expenses and available revenue is where a lot of small nonprofit crises are born. ZeroDivide's exact situation. They had funds, but they were restricted. They needed unrestricted funds. And instead of going about that, solving that problem in one of the right ways, they chose the wrong way. So how do you do it the right way? Let me show you. In your accounting software, every restricted gift when it comes in gets recognized in a set of accounts called temporarily restricted. They look something like this. This is a profit and loss report, or income statement, or statement of activities. It's all the same thing. It shows your revenues and expenses over a set period of time. For nonprofits, you have regular unrestricted revenue here, and then you have restricted revenue received here. There are a million ways of organizing your profit and loss, and this nonprofit tracks their revenue by source type: individual, government, foundation, corporate. Their restricted accounts then follow the same formula. This particular example is a small nonprofit with $5 million in annual revenue, so keeping it simple works well for them. It may not be the right setup for you, but the broad principles here are the same. You track your restricted revenue and your unrestricted revenue separately from the moment it goes on your books. One big note here is that what I'm describing is a process that you would use in QuickBooks or similar environments, often favored by smaller nonprofits. There is dedicated nonprofit fund accounting software by Aplos, Sage Intact, Blackbaud has some. Those are favored by larger nonprofit organizations, and they do a great job, but their cost is often prohibitive for smaller nonprofits, which is really who I'm primarily speaking to here. So if you're confused about that, that's what's going on. Okay, back to the P&L. On the expense side, there are again many different ways of handling the specific method of tracking, but what is very important is that you track the expenses as you book them. In this case, the nonprofit uses a tag called classes that I like to set up as related to specific programs. Your after-school reading program is a class where you can track all program-specific expenses, even when they occur across multiple GL accounts. We can then pull up a dedicated profit and loss report that is specific to this program's restricted revenues and direct costs. QuickBooks does offer some flexibility in precisely how this is set up, including utilizing project codes and custom fields. However you do it, every expense charged to a restricted source gets coded to the fund at the time that you record it. Not retroactively, not when you write the grant report at the time of entry. Then pulling your program-specific classified P&L is a breeze. When you meet the conditions of the restriction, the program ends and you've expended the funds, or the time period is over and you've expended the funds, you finally get to record a release from that restriction. It's over. The restricted funds move from unrestricted, and you are free from your obligation to the donor. Congratulations. Your grant agreement is your roadmap. Read it, ask questions before you sign it, know how much money you're being given, what's the schedule, what's the reporting, what's the schedule, and what to do with any unspent funds at the end of the contract, should there be any. And if you are ever in a situation where unrestricted funds are running low and you're looking at those restricted funds and thinking, just this once I'm going to borrow, no, stop it. No, call an accountant, call a lawyer, call a priest, call your mother. I don't know. Just call anybody, but don't touch those restricted funds. But no, more seriously, call the program officer and ask them. It's their job. They want to help you. They know how to help you. And something can be done. They work with nonprofits literally all the time. But also call your mother. The point is, there are legitimate solutions to unrestricted cash flow problems. Drawing on restricted funds is never one of them. ZeroDivide's board apparently sat in meetings discussing the risks of doing exactly this, and then decided to do it anyway. Don't do that. Setting up your accounting systems correctly from the start is one of the most valuable things that a company can do. My firm, Tucker Business Services, helps nonprofits establish correct accounting systems to track restricted and unrestricted funding in a way that tracks them separately, clearly, and in a way you can actually read. If you are not sure whether your current system is serving your needs, let's talk. Our link is in the description. Restricted versus unrestricted funding. It is a legal obligation, not just an accounting preference, not a suggestion. And ZeroDivide, well, they raised $50 million over 18 years doing excellent work. And they ran out of money because they failed to manage their unrestricted versus restricted funding. And then They were dissolved permanently because of how they mismanaged a few $100,000 in restricted gifts. The California AG pursued this as a civil action, not a criminal case. The directors and officers involved didn't go to jail, but they did face something that professionally will follow them for the rest of their careers: a court order, financial penalties, and a public record showing that under their leadership, donor funds were misused and an organization failed. In the nonprofit world, that is its own kind of sentence. These rules exist to protect the donors who give in good faith and to protect the programs and people the donors believe in. And ultimately, it even protects the organizations themselves, because when you violate donor trust, you're not going to be around very long. Next episode, we'll be talking about board, treasurers, and fiscal oversight more generally, what a good finance committee looks like in a relationship with the executive director, treasurer, finance committee, and the rest of the board. We'll also be taking a look at the COO of Atlanta, one of Atlanta's finest cultural institutions, who federal prosecutors have said for the last 6 years has been buying himself luxury guitars on the museum's money. That one's happening right now in the news. Let's see what we can learn from it. So leave a like if you want to, subscribe for more. I'm Evan, I'm the Nonprofit CFO. I'll see you in the next one.